The winter sun hung low over Napa Valley, casting long shadows between the vine rows that stretched for miles in every direction. The air had that crisp, dry edge that seemed to settle in your bones, a quiet reminder that January never promised. Warmth here? Inside, the house still smelled of fresh paint and dust, as if it hadn't yet decided to belong to me. Boxers lined the hallway, taped and labeled in my handwriting, waiting for a future that I wasn't entirely sure I'd have. I had closed on the house just 3 days ago. 3 days, long enough to unpack a few dishes, to feel safe. I was upstairs, in the study, sorting through a stack of legal documents, when I heard it, the faint metallic sound of a key sliding into the front door lock. It wasn't the creak of old wood or the sigh of a draft. This was deliberate, intentional. The Durapend footsteps measured, steady, crossed the entryway, and started up the stairs. Whoever it was didn't rush, didn't hesitate, as if they already had the right to be here. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to stand still to listen. Halfway up, a man's voice called out, "Anyone home?" The tone wasn't aggressive, but there was a weight to it, like he was expecting an answer he might not like. I stepped into view at the top of the stairs. He stopped. For a moment we just looked at each other. Me in my worn sweater and jeans, him in a dark coat that looked expensive enough to match the gold watch peeking from his cuff. "You must be Scarlett," he said, not quite a question. His eyes narrowed slightly, scanning me in a way that felt less like curiosity and more like a calculation. "I'm Ethan," he continued, "Andrew's brother." The resemblance was undeniable. Same height, same sharp jawline. The same way the eyes seemed to measure a room before deciding whether to trust it. I didn't move from the top step. "You have a key to this house?" He gave a short, humorless laugh. "It's my brother's house." "That's funny," I said, finally starting down toward him, "because my name is the only one on the deed now." Ethan's gaze flicked to the boxers behind men, then back to my face. "Mind explaining why you're living here?" Instead of answering, I walked past him into the living room, picked up my phone from the coffee table, and held it out. "Why don't you ask your brother? Put it on speaker." For a second he didn't move. Then he took the phone, tapped the screen, and lifted it so I could hear. The call connected almost instantly. Ethan Andrews' voice came through, smooth but with an edge I knew too well. "What's going on?" "I'm here at the house," Ethan said, his eyes still locked on me. "Scarlett," I told. "You not to get involved?" Andrew cut in sharply. "Just leave, she knows what she's doing." There was a pause, just long enough for Ethan's brow to furrow before the lion went dead. He lowered the phone slowly, like he was processing something he didn't quite believe. "What the hell is going on here?" I met his stare and smiled just barely. "Why don't you take a seat, Ethan? This is going to take a while." The truth was coming, and when it did, it wouldn't be pretty. At 18, he thought I knew what independence meant. My mother, Elaine Carter, had raised Melone since I was a toddler. She wasn't unkind, but she lived her life with a kind of restless energy that never let her stay in one place or with one man for long. That year, she sat me down at the kitchen table of our small apartment and told me she was marrying a man from Spain. They were moving to Madrid. She said matter-of-factly, stirring sugar into her coffee, "You're starting college in the fall, and this is your chance to grow up on your own." She didn't ask if I was okay with it. She didn't hug me. She just left 2 weeks later with 2 oversized suitcases and a promised tow call when she could. I spent the next 3 years learning what solitude really was. My life was small. Classes, part-time work at a bookstore, cheap takeout for dinner, but it was mine. Then, in my junior year, I met Andrew. He was 12 years older, a business owner who seemed meadow step out of a different world entirely. He wore tailored suits, drove a black Mercedes, and carried himself like someone who had already solved every problem life could throw at him. I met him at a charity auction I was helping set up, and he was the first man who made me feel like more than a face in the crowd. Andrew had a way of making everything seem easy. Dinner dates turned into weekend trips. Weekend trips turned into long, lingering conversations about the future. By the time I graduated, the idea of marrying him felt less like a choice, and more like a natural next step. When we announced our engagement, my mother flew in from Milan. Apparently Madrid hadn't lasted long to attend the wedding. She arrived in a whirlwind of perfume and designer luggage, greeting Andrew with the kind of assessing look she used to reserve for job interviews. On the morning of the ceremony, she handed me a slim envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for a substantial amount for the house, she said, "but make sure the deed has both your names. Always protect yourself, Scarlett." I took her advice, though at the time it felt more like a formality than a safeguard. Andrew and I found a 2-story place just outside Napa with a wide front porch and enough space for the life we planned to build. The vineyard air was different, cleaner, quieter, like the world had slowed down just for us. The first year of our marriage was a blur of wine tastings, late-night talks by the fireplace, and dreams we sketched out on napkins at the kitchen counter. But somewhere between those early mornings and late nights, he began to notice small cracks in the picture-perfect life we had painted. Andrew traveled more often, his business deals pulling him to cities I'd never even visited. He stopped asking if I wanted to come along. He stopped calling when he was away. And when he was home, his phone was always within reach, always lighting up with messages, he never explained. I told myself it was just the stress of his work, that I was imagining the distance growing between us. But in the quiet hours alone in that big house, I sometimes caught myself wondering if my mother had been right. Not about love, but about protection. Back then, I didn't know just how much I would need it. It started with the little things, the kind you almost convince yourself not to notice. Andrew's smile didn't reach his eyes anymore. His phone seemed to live in his hand, his thumb flicking across the screen even during dinner, and he had a new habit, stepping outside to take calls, speaking in a voice so low it blurred into the hum of the wind. At first, I told myself this was just the rhythm of marriage settling in. We'd been married nearly 5 years now. Life wasn't supposed to feel like the honeymoon stage forever, but there was something else, something sharper that kept me awake at night. 1. Tuesday morning. I was pouring coffee when I saw him transfer a large sum from our joint account into one I didn't recognize. He brushed it off when I asked, saying it was for business restructuring. But the tone in his voice made it clear the conversation was over. The trips became longer, the explanations became shorter. And then there was the scent, a trace of unfamiliar perfume clinging to the collar of his shirt one evening when he came home late. It wasn't mine. I thought about asking him directly, but I could already hear the way he would twist the question into an accusation, how he would make me feel small for even wondering. So, I stayed quiet, storing every detail in the corners of my mind. That winter, I caught the flu, or what I thought was the flu. The fever didn't break for days. I felt weaker than I had ever been, my body unwilling to fight back. Andrew seemed irritated by my illness, as if it had inconvenienced him. He brought me takeout instead of cooking, left bottles of water by the bed without saying much. One night I woke to the sound of his voice in the hallway. He wasn't on the phone. He was speaking to someone in the house. I recognized the softer, almost affectionate tone he used, the one he hadn't directed at me in months. When I stepped out of the bedroom, there was no one there. Just the faint scent of that same perfume hanging in the air, and the front door clicking shut. 2 days later, I overheard him in the study. I'd gone upstairs to find my laptop charger, but stopped just short of the open door. When I heard my name, "She's too weak to put up a fight," he said. "We'll get her to sign the papers. Once that's done, we can sell the place. It's only a matter of time anyway." Silence. Then a woman's voice, low, smooth. "You said she wouldn't last the year," he exhaled, almost like he was smiling. "She won't." I stood frozen in the hallway, my mind refusing to catch up with my ears. He wasn't just planning to leave me. He was planning to erase me, my home, my security, maybe even my dignity before I was gone. That night I didn't confront him. I didn't cry, didn't scream. Instead, I lay awake, the fever burning in my skin, replaying every word. Somewhere between those hours, a decision took root. If Andrew thought I was too weak to fight back, he was about to find out just how wrong he was. The next morning, I moved through the house like nothing had changed. Andrew left early, a quick kiss on my forehead, cold prefunctor, before heading out. I waited until the sound of his car disappeared down the road before I exhaled, my chest aching from holding my breath. I made tea, not because I wanted it, but because I needed the noise of the kettle to steady my thoughts. Every detail of the previous night replayed in my mind, not as pain anymore, but as evidence I could use. The first step was securing what was left of my life. I dug through his desk in the study until I found the envelope with my mother's original wedding gift, the deed to the house, both our names printed in neat black ink. I took photos of every page, then tucked the papers into a folder and slid it into my bag. Next, I called a real estate attorney in San Francisco. I didn't tell her everything at first, just enough to make her listen. "My husband is planning to sell our house without my consent," I said. "I have proof the property is jointly owned." She told me to come in the next morning. That night, Andrew came home later than usual. He didn't ask about my day, didn't notice the way I kept my phone in my pocket instead of leaving it on the counter, but I noticed him, how relaxed he'd seemed, how certain that whatever plan he'd made was already set in motion. The next week became a performance. I acted tired, compliant, too distracted by my illness to pay attention to much else. In reality, I was making copies of bank statements, forwarding emails to a secure account, and documenting every conversation where he hinted at the sale. One afternoon while he was out, I found a folder in his desk labeled Property Transfer. Inside was a draft contract for the sale of our house, already signed by him but missing my signature. The buyer's name meant nothing to me, but the date did. The closing was set for just 2 weeks away. That was when the anger shifted into something colder, sharper. This wasn't just betrayal, it was theft, and he thought he could get away with it because he believed I wouldn't live long enough to stop him. At the attorney's office, I laid everything out. She didn't flinch. "We can block the sale," she said. "And if your husband tries tome of joint funds without your consent, we can freeze the accounts." She leaned forward, her voice low. "But Scarlett, ifo do this, there's no going back." I met her eyes and felt the last thread of hesitation snap. "I don't want to go back." By the end of that week, the papers were filed. Andrew had no idea. I still cooked dinner, still asked about his day, still played the role of the ailing wife. But inside, I was waiting for the moment he realized his perfect scheme had just shattered. The waiting was almost worse than the illness. Every time he glanced at his phone and smiled faintly, I wondered if the buyer had called, if he still thought the deal was alive. And every time I bit back the urge to tell him the truth, not yet. The longer he believed he was winning, the sweeter it would be when he finally saw just how badly he'd lost. It happened on a Wednesday morning, 2 days before the supposed closing date. I was in the kitchen making oatmeal when I heard the front door slam open. Andrew's footsteps were heavy, uneven, like each one was powered by something more than just urgency. "Anger, Scarlett," he barked, his voice echoing through the hallway. I stirred the pot slowly, deliberately, before turning toward him, mourning. His jaw was tight, a vein pulsing at his temple. "What the hell did you do?" I tilted my head. "About what?" "Don't play games with me," he snapped, tossing a thick stack of papers onto the counter. "The escrow company says the sale's been frozen. My accounts are locked. You think you're clever?" I let me gaze drift down to the papers, then back up to his face. "I think I'm protecting what's mine." His laugh was short, humorless. "Yours. You're barely holding yourself together, and you think you can outmaneuver me. This house, the money, it's all tied to me. Without me, you wouldn't." I cut him off, my voice steady. "Without you, Andrew, I'd still have my dignity." That stopped him for half a second, but then he leaned closer, his voice dropping into a hiss. "You're going to regret this. When that illness finishes what it started, you won't even be here to enjoy whatever scraps you've managed to keep." The words were meant to cut deep, and they did, but not the way he expected. Instead, off breaking me, they hardened something inside. He still believed the same lie he'd been telling himself for months, that I was too weak, too sick, too close to the end to be a real threat. I didn't answer him. Instead, I turned back to the stove, stirring the oatmeal like our conversation was already over. The silence stretched, thick and tense. Finally, he muttered something under his breath and stormed out, the door rattling in its frame as it closed. From the window, I watched him back out off the driveway, his movements jerky. I knew where he was, going straight to his business partner to figure out what went wrong. What he didn't know was that every avenue he tried to reopen had already been blocked. That afternoon, my attorney called. He tried to transfer funds from one of the smaller accounts, she said. "We stopped it before it cleared. He's not going to have access to anything without your signature from now on." I thanked her, hanging up with a smile I hadn't felt in months. It wasn't victory yet, but it was close. That evening, Andrew didn't come home. His car never pulled into the driveway. His footsteps never crossed the porch. I went to bed in a quiet house, the kind of quiet that wasn't lonely. It was peaceful, but I knew the storm wasn't over. Men like Andrew didn't just walk away when they lost control. They found new angles, new weapons, and I had to be ready for whatever he tried next. Still, as I lay there in the dark, I couldn't help imagining his face when the escrow officer told him the sale was dead. The shock, the disbelief, the slow realization that his careful lick-and-struct plan had just collapsed. It was a small taste of justice, and it was intoxicating. He came back 3 days later, just after sunset. I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway and the familiar creak of the front gate. For a moment, I considered locking the door and letting him knock until his anger wore itself out, but I didn't want him thinking I was hiding. When he walked in, he looked different, less polished, like the stress had begun to crack the veneer. His tie was loose, his shirt wrinkled, and there was a faint smell of alcohol clinging to him. "Scarlett," he began, his tone softer this time, "one need to talk." I leaned against the doorway to the kitchen, arms crossed. "About the sale you tried to push through without me." He exhaled sharply, forcing a smile. "Look, I handled it wrong. I admit that, but we can still work this out. If you just sign the papers, we can both walk away with enough to be comfortable. Comfortable. The words sat between us like a rotten fruit. He wasn't talking about me, being comfortable. He was talking about himself. I shook my head. Not happening. Something shifted in his expression. Then the fake warmth evaporated, replaced by a colder calculation. You think you can just sit here? In this house, while you're too sick to even keep up with the bills? You can't live like this forever, Scarlett. And you know I can make things difficult. I didn't flinch. You already have. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. There are other ways to get your name off the title. You think you've blocked me legally? But you haven't thought of everything. I held his gaze, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable for him. Try, I said finally. Just try. That night, I barely slept. Not because of fear, but because of the clarity his words had given me. Andrew wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted. And what he wanted was for me to disappear from his life with nothing. 2 days later, I got my first taste of his next move. A notice arrived in the mail from the bank, informing me that our joint credit line had been maxed out. I hadn't touched it in months. I called the bank immediately. Those charges aren't mine, I told their representative. You need to freeze that account. We can, she replied, but only if both account holders agree. I smiled to myself. Then I guess I'll see you in court. It was the same with utilities, insurance. Suddenly, bills were overdue. Policies were accidentally canceled. He was trying to squeeze me financially, make life in the house unbearable until I gave in. But every time he made a move, I countered. I opened my own accounts, switched service providers, and kept meticulous records of every sabotage attempt. My attorney called it a slow war of attrition. One night, I found myself sitting at the dining room table with all the documents spread out in front of me. Bank statements, emails, legal filings. I realized I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was building a case. If Andrew wanted a war, I was going to make sure he lost more than just the house. Still, I couldn't shake Keith's sense that he was holding something back, something bigger, the kind of move you saved for when all else failed. And in the pit of my stomach, I knew he was getting ready to play it. It was a cold Friday morning when the knock came. Not polite, tentative kind, but hard. Deliberate, the kind that makes your stomach tighten before you even reach the door. 2 men in dark suits stood on the porch. One held a clipboard, the other a folded envelope. Scarlett Moore, the taller one, asked. Yes, he handed Meth's envelope. You've been served. Inside were eviction papers. Andrew had filed a claim asserting, I had violated some clause in our marriage agreement when I barely remembered signing years ago, giving him full control of the property in the event of medical incapacity. It was a clever move. Cruel but clever. If it worked, he could force me out of my own home within 30 days. I set the papers on the table and stared at them for a long moment. I wasn't shaking. He wasn't even angry. What I felt was something far more dangerous for him. Resolve. When I called my attorney, she didn't sound surprised. I wondered when had played that card, she said. But don't worry, it's going to backfire. How? I asked. Because that clause was contingent on medical proof. And right now, your doctor's reports say you're improving, not incapacitated. We'll contest this and demand full financial disclosure in the process. That's the last thing he wants. I could almost see it unfolding in my mind. Andrew sitting across from a judge, squirming as every shady transfer and hidden account was dragged into the light. But he was. Over the next week, I started noticing a white SUV parked down the street, always in a different spot, but never far from the house. I'd catch glimpses of a woman in the driver's seat, dark sunglasses hiding her face. Then the phone calls began. No one spoke when I answered, just breathing, then a click. My attorney told me to document everything, so I started keeping a log by the phone. Date, time, number, duration. Every detail went into the file. The real blow came on a Sunday afternoon. I'd been in the garden cutting back the last of the roses before winter. When I heard the crunch off gravel, Andrew's car, he didn't bother knocking. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said, stepping onto the porch. I stayed, where I was pruning shears in hand. Harder for who? His eyes flicked toward Thea's ears, then back to my face. You're not going to win. You're sick. You're alone. And you're wasting what little time you have left. I smiled faintly. That's where you're wrong, Andrew. I'm not wasting anything. I'm investing. He frowned. In what? I turned back to Theros Bush, clipping a dying branch in your downfall. Something in my tone must have gotten to him because for the first time in months he didn't have a comeback. He just stared at me, his jaw working like he was chewing on a response he couldn't quite form. Then he left fast without another word. As I watched his car disappear down the road, I realized the balance had shifted. He thought this eviction stunt would corner me, but instead it had given me exactly what I needed, a clear legal pathway to expose everything he'd done. The game wasn't over, but for the first time I was certain he wasn't the one in control. The first hearing was set for a Thursday morning in downtown Napa. I arrived early, dressed in the one suit that still fit well, my hair pulled back, documents neatly stacked in a leather folder. My attorney, Claire, was already waiting outside the courtroom, her expression calm, but razor sharp. Inside, Andrew sat at the opposite table, flanked by his lawyer, a man with the kind of slick confidence that came from billing by the hour. Andrew didn't look at me, not once. When the judge entered, the room settled into silence. Claire stood first. Your Honor, my client's husband is attempting to invoke a clause from a marital agreement signed under duress using fabricated claims of medical incapacity to seize her home. We have clear medical documentation proving she is not incapacitated, along with evidence of financieless cant on his part. The judge raised an eyebrow. Financial misconduct. Claire nodded and slid a thick file on Tath bench, bank statements, wire transfers, and property records, all showing Mr. Moore's attempts to liquidate marital assets without Mrs. Moore's consent, including this property. Andrew's lawyer objected, claiming the documents were irrelevant to the matter at hand, but the judge overruled him. They go directly to motive, she said. Then it was Andrew's. He claimed he was acting out of concern that I was too ill to manage the property, and that he had only her best interests at heart. Claire didn't even flinch. If that's true, why did you transfer $48,000 to an account jointly held with another woman less than a week after initiating the eviction? The silence that followed was almost tangible. Andrew's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. His lawyer scrambled for a rebuttal, but the damage was done. Over the next 2 hours, we dismantled every piece of his case. The so-called medical clause, nullified by updated doctor's reports. The claim I'd fled to maintain the property countered with receipts and photos. Every time they tried to push me into a corner, we came back with something stronger. By the time the judge adjourned, Andrew's confidence had slipped into something else, entirely panic. He avoided my ISIS. We filed out of the courtroom, his steps quick, like he couldn't get away fast enough. In the hallway, Claire leaned close. We've got him. He's exposed now. All we have to do is keep the pressure on. That afternoon, we filed a motion for a full forensic audit of all marital assets. If granted, it would mean combing through every account, every transaction, every hidden stash of money he thought I didn't know about. It was risky. If we lost, I could end up with nothing but legal bills. Booty wasn't playing for safety anymore. I was playing for everything. The following week, the court granted our motion. Andrew now had 30 days to turn over every financial record in his possession. 30 days to watch his carefully built lies start to unravel. That night, I stood on the porch, the winter air sharp against my skin. And for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. The war wasn't over, but the tide had turned. He had thrown everything at me. Financial sabotage, legal threats, psychological games, and I was still standing. Better yet, I was winning. 30 days later, Wemmet in court again. Andrew looked different this time. Less polished, a little hollow around the eyes. The perfect suit hanging just slightly wrong in his frame. He turned over the financial records, but not willingly. The court had to issue a compliance order after he missed the deadline twice. Claire and I sat side by side as the forensic accountant presented his findings. Transaction after transaction appeared on the big screen: wire transfers to offshore accounts, cash withdrawals in Las Vegas, real estate purchases under shell companies. But the most damning was a single payment. $120,000 to a private escrow account initiated just days before he tried to evict me. The judge's face tightened. Mr. Moore, would you care to explain the purpose of these transfers? Andrew's lawyer started to speak, but the judge held up a hand. From you, Mr. Moore. Andrew swallowed hard. They were investments. Claire stood. Investments that are now inaccessible, Your Honor, because the receiving account belongs to a woman identified as his mistress. These funds came directly from the sale of jointly owned assets without my client's consent. The judge leaned back. The weight of the evidence settling over theorem, Mr. Fairmore. Your conduct is a blatant violation of both marital low-end fiduciary duty. Effective immediately. This court orders the return of all misappropriated funds to Mrs. Moore, the reinstatement of her sole ownership of the Napa property, and the award of attorney's fees in her favor. It was over. Just like that, Andrew's head dropped, his hands gripping the table so tightly his knuckles widened. He didn't look at me. Not when the gavel came down, not when the bailiff called the next case, not even as we passed each other in the aisle. Outside the courthouse, the air smelled of rain. Claire handed me the final judgment papers. You've got your house, your money, and your freedom. He's got nothing. I should have felt triumphant, and I did, but it was a quiet kind of victory. The kind that sinks in slowly like warmth after a long cold. I drove back to the vineyard in silence, watching the hills roll past, the winter sun breaking through the clouds. When I pulled into the driveway, the house stood exactly as it had that first day. Fresh paint, empty corners, the smell officeability lingering in the air. Only now it was mine, fully, indisputably, and I walked through the rooms, touching the walls, the banister, the kitchen, counter. This place had been the battleground, the prize, and the anchor that kept me from drifting when everything else tried to pull me under. That evening, I lit a fire in the living room and opened a bottle of wine from the cellar. I poured a single glass, sat by the window, and let the quiet settle around me. Andrew was probably somewhere scrambling to rebuild, trying to charm his way into someone else's resources. Maybe he'd succeed, maybe he wouldn't, but it didn't matter. He no longer had a claim on me, my life, or my home. And that was the sweetest revenge of all.